Welcome, folks, to Dicey Banter. This is the TTRPG Talk Show where we speak to all the makers and shakers within the tabletop space and have fun and meaningful conversations while we're at it. And with that, before we get started, folks, I and this channel, as always, stand against genocide and ethnic cleansing, and we support all the oppressed peoples all over the world struggling against injustice, imperialism, and colonization. Free DRC, free Sudan, free Palestine, and free Lebanon. So thank you all so much. Please take this time as a reminder to call your reps, support Palestine, and donate to the charities that are helping folks on the ground, and continue to talk about these affected areas. And with that, hello everyone. I'm Valiant Dorian. I use he him his pronouns. I'm a TTRPG performer, GM, writer, Twitch writer, streamer, and your host this evening for Dicey Banter. And I have the distinct pleasure of interviewing our amazing guests who you see right here on our overlay. They are the founder and director of Drowning Moon Studios, a small press role-playing game publisher with fantastic games such as Follow Me Down, a channel beloved for the regulars over here, Mage to Order, and Stark Hollow Hall. Please welcome Joie Martin. Joie, please introduce yourself to the audience.
Hi, I'm Joie Martin. I use they, them pronouns, and I, as Valiant Dorian said, am a founder of a tiny independent TTRPG studio called Drowning Moon Studios.
And we love Drowning Moon Studios here on the Otso SpiritBear channel over here. We love Follow Me Down. And we're here to talk about another game, an upcoming game, I dare say. We'll be talking about all things Final Girl Rising, a powered by the apocalypse tabletop role-playing game that explores and dissects the popular horror trope of the final girl. And it arrives just in time for a spooky season. Happy October, everybody. And in Final Girl Rising, players portray one of six horror movie heroine archetypes, doing whatever it takes to survive until the credits roll. It is an explosive tabletop role-playing experience and a love letter to the slasher genre, feminine horror, and the will to survive. If that sounds like something you'd like, which it really should be, please use exclamation point final girl in chat to get a link to the campaign and give this game your support and back it. Thank you all so much. And if you're enjoying tonight's Dicey Banner, please consider donating and leaving us a tip. The funds raised will be used to tip myself and our guests to show our appreciation. So use exclamation point donate in chat to support us. Thank you all very, very much. Enjoy. I think now is the best time for us to get right into the interview. And be- as my guests on Dicey Banner, I have to adhere to the traditions that we have here. And that tradition is I have to ask your origin story, how you got into TTRPGs and such. And so I'm going to ask you this: how did you get into the TTRPG hobby?
So with me, I previously came from LARPing and like writing and running live
Oh,
action games.
cool. Ooh,
So I had
writing
been doing that.
action games. That's so cool. So you have always designed games.
Yeah, pretty much. Like I did my first live action rule design back in like 1999, I want to say. So a while ago.
Yeah.
And eventually I just started, I was like, well, if I can make LARP systems with no problem, I suppose I could probably make like TTRPG systems. And the way I started doing is I was literally just making stuff in like, Google Docs or like Microsoft Word and just releasing it as pay as you want on like Drive Through RPG and Itch.
Oh my
And
god.
it just kind of spiraled up from there.
That is so deeply cool. Usually when my guests, talk about TTRPGs and about their experience with it, it's usually the playing comes first and then after a while the design comes after. But it's you've been at the design game for a while now. But before I ask you about your origin story about game design, I do want to ask so other than LARPing, what was your first sort of like TTRPG you got into? Um
So weirdly, my very first TTRPG experience was Call of Cthulhu, which is like
Wow, yeah.
that's not when people normally start with, but
Not typical. No, yeah.
that was what the group I was playing with wanted to play, so that's what we played. So that was my very first experience.
So a horror game was
Yes,
your origin story. Would it be fair for me to say that you are a horror appreciator? Is that your favorite genre, maybe?
it is. And it sneaks out into all of my work. Even when I'm like trying to write something completely normal, there's like a little bit of horror that just kind of sneaks in there when I'm not looking.
Now I'm looking at Follow Me Down and some of the aspects of I adore Follow Me Down. We've done 2 actual plays on this channel for Follow Me Down. So we love that game here. And now I'm looking back, I'm like, oh yeah, that is kind of scary actually, some of these aspects that you've written there. Very, very cool. Amazing. So an incredible introduction to tabletop role playing games. Um, so I wanted to ask you about what kept you in the hobby. It's such a you've been at this for so long. It's such a niche within a niche hobby. As you said, you started with LARPing, got into
Mhm.
TTRPGs, played Call of Cthulhu. Um, what has kept you in this space, in this niche for so long?
It's mostly I really like storytelling and interactive storytelling. I like
Hmm.
the idea and practice of collaborative stories, like everybody adding a little bit of themselves or a little bit of what
Hmm.
they want to play through into creating like a cohesive whole. And
Amazing.
like there have been times where I've taken breaks where like I didn't have a group to play with or I wasn't writing something. And I always end up coming back to it because I miss that aspect of storytelling and like the depths
Mm.
of character that you can get into by doing it.
Um, that is brilliant and so deeply cool. Now I gotta ask you about your game design origin story now. So you started in 1999.
Yes.
Wild time to be starting game design. What was the impetus for you to start game designing in the first place? I know you said LARP, you were part of LARPing and you did live action stuff, but what really inspired you to take that step?
I mean, starting with LARPing, it was I had an idea that for like a world that I wanted to
Mm,
build, and so it's like this sounds like instead of like trying to write it as a novel or something, which
hmm.
novels are hard to write, of course.
Okay.
Um, I was like, this might be interesting if I made it a game and people could play through it, and that's kind of like was my jumping off point.
Mm,
Because I had a lot of friends that were involved in the LARP community near where I lived. It was a really
mm,
large group, a lot of people. Funnily enough, I was in Atlanta, Georgia at the time, so I ended up LARPing
okay.
with a lot of the people from the original White Wolf studio, which I think
Whoa.
actually helped me because when I got into TTRPGs, I wasn't like dazzled by anybody because I'm like, I know these people, I've grown up with them. So it made it a little bit easier to not be intimidated.
This is so wild, but this is a story I hear though about that's I feel kind of unique to our particular hobby and slash industry slash community. Is the fact that like if you really drill down and dig into it, like at some point everyone knows everybody. They're like maybe
Mhm.
2 to 3 like bands apart, like in
Yes.
terms of like knowing one another. That is so cool. So you started writing world based stuff for LARPs.
Mhm.
When did that change or transition into writing full-fledged games for TTRPGs?
So that was actually a little more recent. It was about 6 or 7 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it was literally just I had some ideas that I didn't think were going to work as LARPs.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it would be better to either make them like short stories or make them like small games. And
Mm-hmm.
so I transitioned into making just smaller games. And because I'm someone who's almost always written their own rule systems, that's where I started, was coming in just creating new systems.
Mm-hmm.
And then after a while, when I was actually, meeting other people in the TTRPG industry, I was
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, you could actually do things like hacks. So I
Yeah.
started doing those a little bit later because I didn't realize it was an option at first.
That is something I've heard a lot. What I remember when I first joined the TTRPG space, which is in the summer of 2021. I'm a youngin. I'm a youngin over here. But one of the few things that I heard from a lot of my game design peers when they were trying to encourage us to game design and have fun with that, they said you could just hack a system, and I just sat there going, "What does that mean? What does what does hack a system mean? I thought you gotta come up with the numbers and stuff like that yourself." And speaking of coming up with the numbers yourself, as you said, you are the founder of a beloved indie publisher for TTRPGs, and I wanted to ask what made you make that decision to start your own publishing, your own little studio for your games, and you know, start doing math on multiple fronts as part of your career?
I mean, it was at first I was just writing games and I didn't
Mhm,
really have like an outlet for them.
mhm,
So I was like, well, if I put them up on, something like DTRPG and
mhm.
let people pay what they want, then maybe I can just like, make a little, like, a couple $100 every couple of months and selling these.
Yeah.
And then when everything kind of shut down in 2020,
Oh
I
yeah.
kind of made the jump into doing it full time because, I was stuck at home along with everybody else.
Mm,
And I had just gotten off of like a long illness. So trying to find a
mhm.
job like right then would have been really, really difficult. So I
Absolutely.
was like, you know what? I'm just going to try to like lean into what I've been doing kind of on the side and make it my business.
Mm.
And fortunately, that worked.
Yeah, 2020 really was a huge point, I think, for our space in general. A lot of folks, I got into playing D&D right in 2020 because my
Mm.
friend in Scotland said, well, it's not just 2 weeks of a lockdowns and you're not getting a job anytime soon. You want to play on Friday afternoons in my international furry D&D campaign that's fully homebrew? So there's a new player, and now I'm here with a talk show and everything. So it's 2020 has been such an important sort of, I don't even like it is such an important transitional point, I think, for a lot of folks, especially creatively, where folks were able to
Yeah.
start doing cool things. And you did, and you started Drowning Moon Studios with many beloved games, including Follow Me Down. And as such, now I gotta ask you a fun question. This is a question I ask all my game designers. It's very, very important for me to ask. What makes a Joey Core slash Drowning Moon Studios core game? What are the themes? What are the elements, mechanics that make those kind of games?
Well, as I mentioned before, horror sneaks into everything I do, even when I try not to do it. So I think that's probably one of the bigger calling cards. But I also tend to lean more into like narrative design as opposed
Mm,
to like really, really crunchy things. Like
mhm.
I have been told sometimes that my narrative games are too crunchy. So, take that as it is. But my preference is like leaning into narrative and letting players experiment and do weird and creative things. I'm
Mhm.
very much like a rule of cool GM, and I kind of try to lean
Love
into that
that.
when I'm designing systems and games for systems as well.
Oh, I love that. Amazing. Thank you for that incredible answer. Had putting that into the fun little dicey better archives of what makes game designer core games. And with that, let's talk about your upcoming game.
Okay.
You are currently, when this episode comes out, you are currently crowdfunding Final Girl Rising.
Mhm.
As we mentioned, it is a fully horror game. It's not just sneaking in.
Yes.
It is fully horror game, fully inspired by slasher horror specifically. And I wanted to ask you about the specific game and what inspired you to design a game with this very specific premise of using the final girl trope and slasher horror as key cornerstones.
So I think, especially with horror fans that are assigned female at birth or are raised to be in a more feminine space,
Hmm.
there's this aspect of being seen as a woman, seen as female,
Hmm.
that you can kind of find yourself sometimes in horror genre. Like the final girl, especially, is somebody who has dealt with a whole lot of trauma, a whole lot of very like
Hmm.
serious, difficult things to overcome. And I think a lot of times, given like how patriarchy works, a lot of the times people who are raised as
Hmm.
assigned female at birth have these things that have happened to them or that they have experienced that make them feel like they need to push forward no matter what. So a
Yeah.
lot of us, I think, like see ourselves mirrored in the final girl. Like she's experienced all these horrible things, but she's managed to survive. Sometimes she's managed to get revenge,
Hmm.
depending on the movie or the series. And I think that's kind of what appealed to me as well, because it's a favorite trope of mine as well. And it's
Oh yeah.
definitely something that I identified very strongly with. So I was like, well, what if I take this idea and make it to where everybody is playing final girls, quote unquote. Like
Mm,
usually there's just one, but in this case, any of them could be the final girl. They're not based on like the typical good girl stereotype. A lot of
yeah.
times in slasher horror, the final girl has got to be like very pure. She doesn't have sex. She doesn't do drugs. She doesn't smoke. She doesn't break rules. And
Yeah.
in this case, I wanted to take tropes that were used for other feminine characters in the horror genre and make it to where
Mm,
they too could potentially succeed, could potentially survive to be a
mm.
final girl.
Absolutely. I mean, we can talk a lot about the male gaze within the final girl trope, especially with what you just mentioned, right? Oftentimes, the final girl has to a lot of the reason they say that is typically a girl next door pure girl who becomes the final girl is to showcase the almost like shocking transition or shocking
Yeah.
transformation into the survivor, also leaning into kind of like becoming the monster in order to survive in some shows, right? And yeah, there's plenty of those sort of like elements within that particular trope. And I wanted to ask you, so was there a particular pop cultural inspiration or like aha moment when you went, all right, this is my next game, I'm going to publish I'm going to work on publish this, or has this kind of been like a longer ongoing process that you've undergone for Final Girl Rising?
It's kind of a little of both. Like
Mm-hmm.
I knew I always wanted to do something with the idea, but I wasn't sure if it was going to be a game or if I was going to, like write a story or like,
Mm.
something like that. Um, but I'm a big fan of like classic slasher movies as well. So like,
Yeah,
the older ones, like the original Nightmare on Elm Street, the original Halloween, Friday the 13th, things
they
like
were
that.
pretty good.
Yeah, and like I love modern ones as well, but that's kind of where I first like came
Mm,
across this particular type of horror trope.
mm-hmm.
And I just had like in my mind when I was forming the idea for the game of like Jamie Lee Curtis playing Laurie Strode, for example,
Ah,
and
yes.
I was like, that would be a great character to play in a game. I thought that was a
Mm,
really interesting concept. And so it kind of like built up from there where I would go back and I'd
mm,
look at some of the old slasher movies, like, Sally Hardesty being a final
yeah.
girl, just all, or like slightly more modern ones like Nev Campbell's character. Um, it just, there was so much like a wealth of information that
Yeah.
I could pull from because there have been so many different variations of that particular character. And I thought what would be interesting to me is like taking all of these and putting them all kind of together and seeing what happens effectively.
Yeah. No, absolutely. We've one thing I've noticed as we've like begun discussing not only about your game design journey and Final Girl Rising is this sort of idea of like choosing and deciding when something is a game versus when it is a narrative or a story. As a game designer and as a writer, you've built worlds and you've built stories, right? And you are narratively driven in a lot of the design choices you make. Um, when how do you come to that decision of deciding whether something that you are creatively pursuing is a game versus a story?
So that's it's actually more complicated than you would imagine because
Hmm.
the problem with like deciding beforehand before you start designing is that
Hmm.
you don't have the impetus to just keep adding things like tacking things on if you're just making a story that's not going to branch out into like a narrative that is going to use rules behind it.
Yeah.
So a lot of the times I will start something as a game just because I'll have a concept and then I'll start hacking something or creating my own rules and
Mm,
seeing how the system develops before I start adding additional world building and things on top of it.
yeah.
And if I have an idea for a game, but it's just not gelling, sometimes like a change of venue effectively, switching it to
Yeah.
some other type of writing will help. And I'll be like, oh, this was not meant to be a game. It was meant to be a story or a book or whatever.
Mm. Oh, that's a. I mean, that was a really complicated premise. I knew that wasn't going to be an easy answer, but you handled that with aplomb, and I appreciate that answer. Thank you so much. That was just something that was percolating in my mind. In terms bringing it back to sort of Final Girl Rising and this game that you have designed, you mentioned earlier about the having building a game where everyone is a final girl. They in fact, for folks who are watching this, players embody archetypes in this game, and specifically archetypes within the horror genre. Typically, a lot of the femme aligned archetypes within the horror genre. When you were building out the archetypes, what was your process? How did you come to the choices of these specific archetypes, bringing them in, and also, as you said just now, like subverting a lot of the expectation of these archetypes? Because typically, it is the innocent girl that becomes the final girl and the one that survives it all. Um, Tell me about your process about like subverting it and choosing the specific archetypes that you've chosen.
So, what I did was, aside from going back and watching a lot of different horror movies, because that was definitely
Oh
part
no!
of the process.
Oh no! What a terrible thing to do!
I know,
Extra
right?
research.
I got to put it on my like work agenda. I'm like from like 3:30 to 5:30, watch horror movies. But
Incredible.
that was part of it. But also like I when I was in college, which was a while ago, I was primarily a literature degree was what I was
Wow.
working toward.
Yeah.
So I had gotten used to reading like papers on different subjects, and there's like a
Mm.
really seminal work of like academic exploration of the trope of the final girl in horror movies by
Oh,
Carol
cool.
Clover.
Mm-hmm.
And I went and got a copy of her book and read through it. And I don't
Hmm.
necessarily agree with all of the things in it because it came out in like the 70s. So
Ah,
some
yes.
of the ideas are a little outdated,
Oh yeah.
but she did make some very good points, and she did a really nice breakdown of like what the different
Hmm.
requirements for slasher horror is, what the different types of women that appear in those particular movies have
Hmm.
trope wise. And then I just like sat down and made a list of like, well, what are the most common tropes that you see in slasher movies? Like,
Hmm.
obviously, you have like the girl next door, which is usually the one that ends up being like, the final girl in most movies because she's
Yeah.
the, innocent, studious one. But then I
Mm.
was like, you also have people who are like, really adventurous. They like to like, make out with people, have sex, do
Hmm.
drugs, party, all of that stuff. I was like, well, that's definitely a trope because that particular style of character shows up in almost every single horror
Oh
movie.
yeah. Oh
And
yeah.
so
Typically one
I
of the
started
first few to go as well.
usually the first one to die. Yeah. And that was one of the other things I was like, well, what if this type of character wasn't the first to die? Like, how
Mm.
would their story change in that way? And then I just kind of just made a list of like, here are the tropes. It's girl next door. It's the party girl. It's the delinquent, which is the one
Mm.
that's like, a little bit dark. And sometimes they like identify with the killer or
Oh yeah.
whatever.
Hmm.
And so I was like, let me see how far I can like boil this down to particular tropes that I could build
Hmm.
archetypes from. And that's kind of where that came from.
That is so cool. To be able to design around these archetypes that are usually have very projected ends. It is often whenever I tune into like a slasher that I haven't seen, I'm like, all right, so who's going first? Probably you. If any, if like tropes are to serve me, and typically, it's you're typically 85 to like 90% correct, right? Whenever you predict those tropes, and we talked about the experience of folks who are AFAB, especially within the horror genre, within the final girl trope, and how it is not only an inspirational trope to for one to be seen as, but also uh, a trope that a lot of folks who are AFAB often have to dissect because we have to consistently engage with misogyny, patriarchy, the male gaze,
Mm.
engage with it. As a non-binary designer, how was when you were designing around this trope within Final Girl Rising, how has your identity and bloomed in your design approach within the mechanics of this game of Final Girl Rising?
So I felt when I was designing it that it needed to kind of stay in the realm of feminine horror,
Mm-hmm.
just because there are certain things people who are assigned female at birth or who are raised in a society where women are considered like lesser than or second class citizens. These are things that they experience that you just don't experience sometimes if you are born another gender.
Yep.
Um, So I felt like it was important to keep it centered in the feminine aspect of horror.
Mm.
And there have been like, you know, other games that kind of worked in a similar manner that were designed by other people. Like Bluebeard's Bride is an excellent example where it's
Yes.
rooted in femininity because that's part of the horror that you
Mm.
experience. And that's kind of the same thing with this particular trope, with these particular characters, them being female or being feminine is part of it feeds into the type of horror they
Mhm.
experience.
I was going to ask a follow-up question to that, which is, as we've alluded to and spoken to before, there is typically a male gaze standard or stain that exists within horror, not only horror, but also within the final girl trope.
Mm.
And especially how the final girl is depicted in those stories. As a designer, how are you maneuvering about the male gaze or a lot of the kind of like tropey aspects of some of the final girl standards that have come before?
So what I did is when I was looking at the different archetypes
Mhm.
and things that I could build out to make interesting character styles for
Mm.
the game, I took the things that they're most known for, and instead of using them as kind of drawbacks or like, you know, negative aspects, I tried to turn them into strengths. So
Mm.
if we're going to stick with like say I was talking about the party girl earlier where she does like, you know, a
Yeah.
lot of illicit substances, one of the abilities she can do in this game is she can use an illicit substance of some sort and she'll heal to harm because she's just not feeling any pain in that moment. And
Mm.
that's what it's taking her to get through and to survive. um, I think
Mm.
also because these particular types of games are kind of a microcosm, like you're not worrying about what it's going to be like, you know, a month down the line, a year down the line. You're really focused on what am I going to do now that is going
Yeah.
to help me get through this. And so a lot of the archetypes I was working with, that I was trying to design for, I was like, well, what are they known for? And if this is considered a weakness, how can it be turned into a strength?
Mm. Amazing. I love that so, so much. And with that, folks, I think this is a great time for us to have a little break. Thank you all so much for hanging out with us. Please get up, stretch, pet your pets. Tell them Mr. Valiant Dorian loves them very, very much. And when we come back, we will talk about the stat names, ghost mechanics, and how to make compelling serial killers. And with that, thank you all so much. I will see you in 10 minutes. Take care, everyone. Bye. Hello, folks, and welcome back to Dicey Banter. I hope you had a wonderful break. I hope you got up, stretched, pet your pets, and told them Mr. Valiant Dorian loves them very, very much. Now, before we get back to the interview with Drowning Moon Studios founder Joie Martin and about Final Girl Rising, I want to remind you about supporting Final Girl Rising. Use exclamation point Final Girl in chat to get the link to the crowdfunding page. Go and support the game, go and back it, and enjoy some really, really cool spooky game inspired by a lot of your favorite slasher horrors, and support it. You'll be supporting an incredible indie designer with that. And if you're enjoying tonight's show, please consider donating. Use exclamation point donate in chat to send a tip with us, or use exclamation point Patreon to support the show long term. Even as a free member, you'll be supporting us greatly. Amazing. And with that, let's jump right back in to Final Girl Rising as we dig in deeper into the mechanics of this game. So, as we mentioned before, folks, Final Girl Rising is a powered by the apocalypse game. And as we get started talking a lot about the mechanics, I gotta ask, why powered by the apocalypse?
I think this particular rule system leans into tropes, and because this is a very
Mm,
trope heavy game, it seemed like the best tool, basically.
uh,
That's how kind of I view rule systems are kind of as like tools to get to where you want to go with the
mm,
story. And
absolutely.
so sometimes certain systems will be better suited for a particular style of game than others.
Mhm.
And I think with anything that's really like trope heavy or archetype heavy, that Power by the Apocalypse works really, really well. It slots in very nicely for that.
Yeah, and within the Power by the Apocalypse system, for folks who are familiar with Power by the Apocalypse, you usually play through playbooks. Typically, D6 system is a 2D6 system, and there are stats. You have usually about like 3 stats for Power by the Apocalypse, sometimes more, it depends. And with that, I want to ask you about a choice that you've made in naming your
Okay.
stats. You've named your stats based on fear responses, which is very, very cool. So for the folks in the audience that are unfamiliar, that's fight, freeze, flee, fawn, those type of fear responses. Why did you do that? Why was that the main choice in naming those stats that way?
Well, because as I mentioned earlier,
Mhm.
the final girl trope is rooted in trauma, and
Mm.
those are trauma responses. And it was kind of like when I was designing the archetypes, I was looking at something that could be considered a weakness and make it a
Mm.
strength. And that's kind of what I wanted to do with the stats as well, is take these things like, fight or flight or fawn, and while they are like normal responses to experiencing trauma,
Yeah.
take that trauma response, which is something that again people would consider a weakness, and turn it into something like a strength. Because
Mm.
when you are have experienced something traumatic, and the way that you respond in kind, it kind of like teaches your brain to be more cautious in certain areas, or to do different things than you would
Mm.
do if you were not otherwise traumatized. But
Yeah.
at the same time, it's teaching you tools for survival when you do that. Like, it's not necessarily, if your trauma response to something is flight, it's not
Mm.
necessarily mean it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to constantly run away from things, but it does mean that you will find ways to adapt
Yeah.
by using this particular trauma response to make it to where you yourself feel safe, you feel
Mhm.
capable of moving forward. And sometimes it can be detrimental, but sometimes it can actually be helpful. Like,
Mhm.
sometimes going with your gut is the best thing to do.
Yeah. No, that's so interesting because, initially in my initial reading of it, I was like, okay, this makes a lot of sense, especially from a game design standpoint. It slots in very nicely. It touches on different aspects of avenues or potential pathways for players to interact with the game and interact with the environment within the game. But through your explanation, there seems to be a lot more flexibility in the way that
Mhm.
these stats can be interpreted, and it kind of opens up a lot of the opportunity for players to be able to interact with the world and flesh out their characters, because it is
Mhm.
at the end of the game still a narrative focused game. And speaking of narrative, typically with the final goal trope, we have an ensemble cast of characters, many of whom are destined and doomed to die, with the final girl surviving. You have created a game where all the characters are final girls or final girl material,
Mhm.
um, aiming to survive and become the final girls. So we are within the context of the game. One will survive is the ending that will herald the ending towards the game. And I wanted to ask you about designing around that, because typically with a lot of tabletop role playing games, sort of like understood dynamic typically for like typical campaigns is you form a party, and you as a party, as a collective, are to maneuver about the world and take down evil, solve the mystery, survive, etc. Right? Obviously, not the exclusive rule of all tabletop RPGs, but that's typical. And I wanted to ask you about your sort of design approach using Powered by the Apocalypse to kind of create this game where one will come out the winner. Hopefully, they might they might still fail at the end, and we'll talk more about the ending. But ultimately, one will quote unquote survive until the final conflict or the final confrontation with the killer. How is the design process around that, and how do you kind of like balance the competitiveness, the gameplay experience for players as they engage with this game?
So it took me a while when I was designing it to try to figure out a way that I could have this group of characters where there might be some competitiveness, but that was not the overall thrust of the game. Like,
Mm.
I didn't want a game where you're literally pushing other characters down to run away,
Mhm.
to just like
Mhm.
chuck them in the killer's path. What I wanted instead was the understanding that despite all of these characters being very different from each other, because the
Mhm.
archetypes are so different, if they rely on each other's strengths and mitigate others' weaknesses, then it makes it more likely that at least one of them will survive. So there are mechanics that are built into it where it's like, you can help out some of your sisters to make sure at least like, one of you is going to make it to the very end. And that said, that doesn't mean there isn't any competitiveness, because that's kind of, if you're in a situation where
Yeah.
you're trying to survive, there might be times where you will make decisions that you wouldn't normally make. But I wanted to keep the kind of idea that, the only real way to win this game is to support each other, even if it doesn't seem like it at first.
No, I love that, and like hearing that approach actually almost augments the tragedy of it all, right? Especially with when you're playing with an ensemble. One of my favorite things in horror is when we actually do see the ensemble cast banding together, but they still get picked off
Mm-hmm.
one by one by a cunning killer. And that's incredibly cool. So, as someone who enjoys your previous games and a lot of the tragedy and drama and also mess that you are able to kind of like write into the games and the dynamics within the characters, um, how how have you tried to facilitate? As you said, you are a real cool GM. You love when the games are able to bring out like strong narrative flow. Uh, how in Final Girl Rising were you able to kind of like encourage players, especially to lean into potential flaws or the drama of or the Shiva? I'm just gonna continue. Enjoy my dog, everybody. And tragedies of being the final girl and the horror within the genre that they're playing into.
um, so one of the things that I in the expanded book, because I have like a quick start out right now,
Oh
so it's
yes.
just like here's the basics of like all the rules, but I don't get a lot of I give myself a lot of time to expand on, like, there are certain tropes in horror that you can lean into, but you can
Mhm.
also use them as like a springboard to make your character more transformative.
Mm,
And that's kind of where I want to um, give people the idea that, hey, this is something you don't necessarily have to stick to like the typical archetype when you have something
mm.
introduced. You can turn it into something else. And
Cool.
it's I like the idea of players being really creative with these sorts of
Mhm.
things. Like, I very much like, if you come up with an idea that sounds really interesting, I'm probably going to let you do it. And I
Mhm.
want to kind of carry that over into the rule book for this, to say, like, look,
Mm.
your players are going to need to be creative anyway to try to like have their characters attempt to escape the situation. So
Mm.
let them try things, let them experiment, let them break away from what you think is typical of a horror movie if you think it's going to serve the story better and make it a more enjoyable game.
Oh, that's really, really cool. I'm very, very excited to read that when the full extended rulebook comes out. That's so, so cool. Amazing. With that, let's talk about ghost mechanics. So for folks, by the way, just because you die in this game does not mean that your role necessarily ends in the gameplay of Final Girl Rising. There are ghost mechanics within this game. For the folks at home that unfamiliar with this mechanic, Joey, um, tell us more about these ghost mechanics.
So, given that this is a game that's got a high lethality rate, like most of the characters are not
Mhm.
supposed to survive by design.
Mm.
I think it's really lame if you're playing a game and your character dies and then you're just kind of sitting at the table waiting for the game to end.
Oh,
It's
your
not
character died? Leave now. Leave the
yeah,
nachos.
basically.
Leave.
Yeah, I that's one of the things I actually like least about certain types of tabletop games. It's just like, if you're dead, at least, let them still interact with the game in some way.
Mm.
And so the way I wanted to design this one is because I knew going in a lot of the characters are going to die. That's like the way the game is meant to go. So it's
Yeah.
like, well, if someone dies, what can they do?
Mm.
And I was like, well, there's a way to keep them playing, but their character itself is not going to come back to life. Usually, sometimes there are always exceptions,
Yeah.
but so I created a move for Final Girl Rising called Channel the Spirit, And it's basically
Mm,
like one of the other living characters finds themselves in a situation where they can't figure out a way out of it. They
mm,
can use the channel of the spirit move to literally just like hand over narrative control of their character to one of the deceased characters, and then the deceased character can then take what they know and their abilities combined with the abilities of the first character and kind of like use everything and say, well, like for example, Queen Bee is one of my archetypes, one of my playbooks.
mm,
Queen Bee is great with dealing with people, with NPCs, with
yeah.
convincing people to do things. But if the Queen Bee is dead, then you can use Channel the Spirit and say, look, I'm bad with people. Like I'm playing the wallflower, so I'm not good at talking to
Mm,
people. But I know that my deceased friend is, so I'm going to let her take the wheel for a little bit and
mm.
show what she knows by helping me out.
That is really, really cool, and I love ghost mechanics. It's one of my favorite mechanics, even in the game. One of my favorite games, which is Invisible Sun, allowing players to be able to interact even as ghosts. Having a ghost stat block is the funniest thing in the world to me. Or ghost moves. But that is such a I got goosebumps when you were like describing that because I'm imagining scenes and potentialities that can be born out of using a move like that. And it is one of the main things that kind of like popped out into my mind is that wow, even as deceased as they help one of the surviving characters, it's almost like they're all surviving together.
Mm-hmm.
And that unity is still there. Was that your intention in being
Yeah,
able to build that
that
mechanic?
yeah, that was entirely intentional. I really
Oh, that's so
wanted it
cool.
to feel like even after characters are dead,
Mhm,
they're still there, they're still present, they're still helping
mm.
each other as best they can to get out of this awful situation.
Oh, that is, really, really, really cool, and I love that so, so much. Um, and talking about the construction of the game and the fact that it is high lethality, there can be elements of PvP, should players, like, lean into that particular element. As a game designer, this is kind of like an ongoing topic that we see in the tabletop space, it seems like, about, like, game designers explaining and almost creating space to discuss things like safety and being able to almost like preempt a lot of the questions about safety in areas that can be difficult to navigate as a table, especially if the subject matter of the game can be scary, horrifying, or triggering to some players. Um, while writing this game, was that something that was in the forefront of your mind in like designing a lot of these, especially since it's high lethality? And if so, like how did you navigate it? What was kind of like your approach in dealing with that question?
So most of the games that I run tend to use tools at the table where you can do things like
Mm,
pause a scene or rewind a scene, or even before the game starts, you can say these are things that I don't particularly want to deal with. I would prefer
mm,
that they not be in the game. I'm a
mhm,
big fan of lines and veils, which is pretty common. There's also I can't remember the name of the system off the top of my head now. There's also one that's which is by Bo Sheldon, which is like you can pause this, you can rewind it. It's just like having a remote control for your
oh
games.
yes,
And I
yes, I'm
find like
familiar with
that
that.
one especially works really, really well with games that have subject matter that can be particularly disturbing. Like you still
Mm,
start at the beginning and you say, these are things I do or do not want at the table. But then while you are in the game itself, you can literally do things like, let's play the scene again and play it in a different way. That way, I'm going forward with something that I, as a player, am more comfortable with,
mm,
as opposed to like, well, this sucky thing happened and I wasn't comfortable, but we got to move forward anyway. I
yeah,
like. I mean, you probably already figured. I really like giving players a lot of narrative control in their games
yes,
because ultimately it's their story that they're telling. Like
hmm,
I might provide the world or the framework or the system, but
hmm,
their experience as their characters is what's really making the story interesting and making really engaged.
hmm,
So I want to give them that level of kind of like authority to know that yes, if you're not comfortable with this, you can pump the brakes and say, hey, or I'm in a good place now. Don't escalate it or things like
mm,
that. And I usually list some of those, or link the TTRPG rule kit
Yeah.
basically in my rule book. So it's like, here's where you can go to get more information if you want to use any of these tools.
No, that's absolutely that's great, and so important to have in a game. And in I think I'd like to think that we as a collective in the space are making those moves in progress. I feel like it is general knowledge that lines and veils are a thing, that there are a plethora of tools that folks can use, not just X and O, X card, traffic light system. Actually, it's called stoplight system, not traffic light system, correcting myself. And being able to be sort of more safety tools literate as we engage with difficult topics, because then we're able to actually engage in a horror game and not have to worry about being triggered or dealing with stuff that we don't like, and such. That's really, really cool. I love that. Awesome. Now let's talk about the ending of this game. Let's talk about the mechanics that you have in this section of this game. And this is something I really like about your design specifically, because you have something similar in Follow Me Down. When Orpheus and Eurydice reunite, there's the gauntlet that happens, right? This is the final section, the final test, that kind of like brings together everything that's come from the past, that's led up to this point, and we get to determine success or failure. There are mechanics if you are the last girl standing, and they're unique ones that facilitate the last part of the gameplay. What were your thoughts in designing these moves and trying to make their impact significant, especially in the final curtain of the game?
So if you are the last standing character in the game, last remaining final girl, you become the final girl, like TM capital letters, the
TM
final girl.
yeah.
you become the trope. And I wanted a way to do that was going to be had more dramatic potential, and would kind of like bring home the idea that like this is like the final confrontation. Here's where you have been saving up all of this energy and all of this motivation to just get out whatever way you can.
Yeah.
And so what I did is I sat down and I created a series of final girl moves. And the only time this is available is when there's one character left. When the one character that remains is trying to get away, they have access to these moves that can help them in more dramatic ways than previously. They can still use the ones that are on their character sheet, but they can also use these. The only catch is that they can only be used once. So if you are trying to use something from this playset and it doesn't succeed, then that's just gone. It raises the stakes, or at least I'm trying to raise the stakes with that, which is like, I'm trying to get away from this killer. I have this access to this brand new set of powers, but I need to use them sparingly and judiciously. And if they fail, that kind of means, well, I'm one more power down than I was when I started with this. And eventually they'll either fail or succeed, and you'll get down to not having any of the final girl moves left, or you'll have one. And I've seen, especially in like doing play testing for this game, sometimes people will like manage to get to a point where they're not 100% away from the killer, but then they'll use like one of the final girl moves, and that'll be the thing that like breaks the cycle of him being able to get to you, and they can get away. And it has like this great like dramatic moment when that happens. When it all comes together like that, I really love when that happens. Obviously, it's not going to happen for every single playthrough, but that's what I'm going for when I was designing these. I want this to be like, I'm going to use this particular power. It seems kind of crazy and over the top, but I can only do it once. And if I don't succeed, then it goes away, and I have less powers in my toolkit to actually make it to the end of the game.
Absolutely. And it's one of my favorite things about reading through that section was like, oh, okay, there's only so many times that these will be available to you before you kind of feel the lights in the tunnel go out, as it were, in typical like horror trope, as doom is pacing toward you. And that is really, really cool to think about. I wanted to ask you about playtests. Have you had moments in playtests where none of the moves were able to save the player?
So that has not happened for me yet. I do have a friend that play tested the game for me as well, and that did happen in one of their sessions. And the final girl player was just not rolling well that day.
Oh no.
And so like, it was very much the killers just like gaining steadily over and over and over again. And they finally got to the point where they had used up all of the final girl moves. They didn't have anything left. And then one of their sisters, who was dead, obviously, because that's, you can't be the final girl if everybody else is still alive in this particular game.
Yeah.
So one of their sisters went, wait a minute, let me take the wheel. Let me, use channel the spirit, and we'll see if I can get you out of here. And there was an electric fence that was surrounding the area they were in. And they did something, I don't remember exactly what it was, but the character that took over for the final girl did something that disabled the electric fence, and they managed to get away just at the very, very last minute.
Oh my goodness. Oh, that's so cool. I would have loved to see that happen. That's amazing and wonderful to witness. Oh, that's so cool. Thank you for answering that. That was just something I was curious about. Awesome. Another key point about the game is not just about the final girls. It's about the killer. The killer is an important impetus for the events that follow for all of the final girls as they endure most likely a day of hardship in order to escape the killer. And I wanted to ask you about the construction of the killer. Um, as we've talked through before, there are loads of like tropey stuff in terms of like villains and the monsters that make the horror genres and the horror characters that we enjoy. What aspects did you draw upon heavily in being able to like help the GM kind of guide the serial killer? And what were stuff that you kind of were like, this isn't really the kind of game I'm creating, and I'm ignoring those tropes for now, and this isn't the experience I want?
So when you're looking at killers in slasher horror, they tend to have a shtick, effectively, like something that really sets them apart, makes them an individual and compared to other killers that are in this typical type of genre. So, for example, Jason wears the hawking mask and carries the machete. He doesn't ever run anywhere. Or like, Freddy Krueger can visit you in dreams, things like that. So what I was doing when I was creating the guide for like, here's how to create a killer is like, first figure out what shtick you want to lean into, like create one, or you can pull from like, popular media. Like, do you want this to be like, a silent, constantly encroaching, like indestructible killer? Or do you want it to be someone more like Candyman, for example, where it's like, he could be there watching, listening, and he will come when called, that sort of thing. So it's basically come up with a concept to kind of lean into and then build from that concept all of the different things. Like, well, if this character is, and I'll use Freddy Krueger as an example, if this character is someone who can attack people or influence people's dreams, what particular powers come along with that? Like, obviously he can transform the dream world around him, meaning that that's an ability he's going to have. And I think, especially with Powered by the Apocalypse, most of these don't require like rolls, because the GM doesn't roll for this. It's sort like, this killer can do this thing because that's what makes them this killer specifically. But they also need to have a reason why they're doing it. Like, going back to Freddy Krueger, he was upset that he got basically like burned alive because he was a terrible human being and just kind of deserved it, honestly. But he did. But
the way you said it, it's like, upon greater reflection, he really did deserve that.
He really did deserve it, but he's mad about it, and that's why he's doing this. He's like taking revenge on teenagers who were kids because he was basically killed in this horrific manner. Bleh, my brain. This really horrific manner where he's like, well, I'm going to get all of these people of this town back for doing this to me, and I'm going to prey on their kids like tenfold at this point. So he's got this motivation to do what he does, why he does it, and how he does it, kind of built into his backstory. And I think that's one of the, once you've gotten like an idea for like a trope or a shtick for a killer,
Mhm.
building on to like why are they doing this, what motivates them, how does their motivation feed into the abilities that they have so it makes
Mm.
sense. And in that way you kind of have you make something iconic that is like unique to your particular game. This
Mhm.
character that's the killer does this for this reason, they do it in this way, and they have these abilities that help them
Mm.
along the way.
That's so cool. And it also occurred to me when I was reading the text that actually Power by the Apocalypse is an incredible system because of the fact that the GM doesn't need to roll, and this sort of um core tenets of GMing a PBTA game being like inflicting harm, soft moves and hard moves are actually extremely conducive in creating a serial killer.
Yeah,
Was
they are.
was what I discovered when I read that section. I was just like, huh. Wouldn't have thought at first glance that Powered by the Apocalypse would be the system that is very conducive in GMing a serial killer, but here we are. Um, Amazing. On the topic of serial killers, just because I'm curious about, I love kind of like tapping into inspo points within the game designers that I'm interviewing. Um, what thematic cornerstones make your favorite sort of like slasher villain? And an additional question onto that is, who is your favorite slasher killer from pop culture?
Well, my favorite is probably always going to be Pamela Voorhees because it was so
Oh
unexpected.
dang! Oh okay, yeah, 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 yeah,
um,
yeah.
because it was like, in further movies in that franchise they went, to Jason, who was
Mhm.
her son, but in the very first one she's the killer. And I think
Yeah.
it's interesting that she's first of all she's a mother, and in a woman, and very different from like what slasher killers
Mm,
became later on, but she was one of the first.
yeah.
And like I can I think part of the reason I like her so much is because even though she like defined a genre, she also broke the rules like at the very, very beginning.
Yeah,
And because
absolutely.
I understood her motivations, even though it was definitely not, like a good thing. I
Yeah.
understood like where she was coming from and why she was so angry.
Mhm.
And I don't know, I thought it was a great idea, and it was so unexpected,
It was an
even,
incredible plot twist.
yeah.
Absolutely. Because as a youngin, I'm 27 years old. I watched the first movie when I was in university. That was the first time I've ever watched it. I was with a friend of mine, and I only knew like, oh, titular character is Jason Voorhees, right? So
Mhm.
I'm expecting him, because of all the time, because of pop culture and all the time that's passed. I'm expecting him to show up. I'm expecting him to be the one behind all the murder. And then we see Pamela Voorhees, and I'm like, oh, it, this was the first movie, and that was the
Mhm.
plot twist. That is incredible. No, I deeply respect that choice. So are those sort of like the thematic cornerstones you like in your slasher killer? Is it's kind of like subverting audience expectation of who the killer is and their motivations.
I do. Like I mentioned Candyman earlier, like
Mm,
he's one of the killers that I kind of feel like a sort of sympathy for, almost, because like
mm,
all of them have their motivations, but his are kind of like on the side of justice sometimes. And so I'm like, he is a bad guy, but he really that bad a guy compared to the other people that are in the franchise? Like all of these things these people have done, he's kind of
mm-hmm,
like, teaching them that, hey, you're not going to get away with this. You might have in the past, but you're not going to going forward.
mm,
And
yeah.
so like I like killers that have something about them that they at the very least feel is meaningful, but it's great if it like translates to the rest of the world they exist in, where
Mm-hmm.
it's like, this person is doing these horrible things to people, but maybe they kind of deserve it sometimes.
Mm,
Like in Candyman's case, which is, a lot of the people that end up dying in his movies did in fact deserve to at least be punished, if not be murdered. Like
mm-hmm.
sometimes murder's a little, harsh, but
Yeah.
they at least deserve some sort of punishment for the things that
Yeah.
they had done.
Oh, that's like one of my favorite tropes in horror is when it is revealed that aspects of the horror are kind of like some sort of comeuppance or
Mhm.
retaliation for past sins that are committed. One of my favorite movies. Um, it I say favorite with an asterisk of I love the concept, wish it was executed better, and I think that's the reason why I love it is that I always rewatch it in the hope that it'll magically become better in a future rewatch. It's called Devil's Carnival. The same writer and
Oh
director
yeah,
of folks who enjoy Repo the Genetic Opera. Same writer, same director. And love the concept. Why was the best song written out? But one of my
I
favorite
know.
aspects was the aspect of like, oh, this is sort of purgatory. There's like an aspect of comeuppance for a lot of these people that are entering the Devil's Carnival, a version of hell, which is really really cool. Anyway, enough about cool horror and stuff. Hey, if you haven't watched Devil's Carnival, maybe go check it out. Um, and the classic slasher horrors. Another question I want to ask in terms of like favorite stuff. You've written a lot of these archetypes for the Final Girl and worked tirelessly in ensuring that they come to theme. Which is your favorite? Whether in story or in the way they play.
So I would say probably the delinquent is my favorite.
Mm,
Just because a lot of times they'll take that particular trope will take unconventional methods. And there's also like a little bit of gray morality sometimes depending on the
mm-hmm.
particular movie. But it's they're an underdog
Yeah.
compared to some of the other tropes. They're the one that people either don't like or they don't think they're useful or they don't think they're worthy of survival, that sort of thing. But then they do something that surprises people.
Yeah.
And I like that idea of like, especially some of them are closer to darkness, closer to the killer than the other
Mm,
tropes. And it
yeah.
gives them like a level of understanding of like, okay, this is an insane situation, but I understand who this person who is trying to harm people is, which
Yeah.
means I can kind of predict what they're going to do. And that itself
Mm.
is a skill.
Oh yeah, no, I love that. Fantastic answer. Alrighty, Joey, as we begin to kind of like wrapping up this interview, I wanted to talk about the journey that you've come on for the entirety of the design of Final Girl Rising. I, as a game designer myself, I sometimes have moments where I think about the game I'm writing, and I have a little daydream, a little imagination time, where I imagine the tables or the games or the campaigns that folks who will take the system will go and play in. And I wonder, and I often like daydream of the quote unquote ideal experience that I hope or wish for players to have when they pick up that game. And I wanted to ask you, what is the experience you wish or hope that the players who pick up a copy of your game will experience as they play through Final Girl Rising?
Honestly, the thing that I'm really trying to foster the most, other than, frightening or creeping people out, which
Hmm.
is always like a goal of a horror game, is the idea of camaraderie. Um,
Mm,
not just among like the characters, but also among the players at the table. Like you can, uh, tabletop role playing is one of those things where you can have, six strangers sit down at a table, and by the end of a session, they're like, chatting and talking with each other. They're
mhm.
learning about each other. They become friends, and
Yeah,
just sometimes within like, a 2 to 4 hour span. And then like even with a campaign, there's just this like tight knittedness that happens
yeah,
after a while where it's like, okay, well, these are people that are on my team right now. This
yeah.
is, an experience that we are building collectively. And by doing so,
Hmm.
by like gassing each other up, by helping each other out, we're creating this sense of community.
Oh, I love that. I love that experience. And with that, Joey, thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you for being on
Thank you for
Dicey
having me.
Banter. Absolutely. Before we wrap up, please tell folks who you are, what are you doing, where they can find you, and how they can support Final Girl Rising within your crowdfunding period or beyond.
So, as I mentioned at the very beginning, I'm Joie Martin. I am the owner of Drowning Moon Studios, founder of Drowning Moon Studios, this very tiny indie tabletop role playing game publisher. And you can find us pretty easily by going to drowningmoonstudios.com. That takes you to the main games website, our main website for the publisher, and it has all of the games that have already been released with some interesting information, blogs, and links and things like that. You can also find me currently, I don't know if this will be true in the future, on Twitter, or X as it's now called, at A Wayward Moon. And you can find Drowning Moon Studios at Drowning Moon RPG. Both of those on Twitter, however long it lasts before it tumbles into the abyss. But if you want to support Final Girl Rising, if you want to back the campaign, we're on Kickstarter October 22nd. And it's a typical, 30-day campaign. So you have plenty of time to make up your mind. And you can literally just go to Kickstarter Final Girl Rising, and that will get you to where you need to go.
Go and back it right now. Go and play this horror game. Live your Final Girl dreams. I endorse this. Please go and play the game. And with that, thank you again, Joie, for being a guest over here on Dicey Banter. I'll do a quick introduction for myself. Hi, everyone. I'm Valiant Dorian. I use him, his pronouns. I've been your host this evening for Dicey Banter. In terms of where you can find me all across the internet, and for however long Twitter is alive, at Valiant Dorian or at Otso SpiritBear. Please enjoy that lovely treasure hunt I just set you on. You can also follow my TTRPG game design Twitter, which is called SpiritBear Games. It is, I believe, at SpiritBear RPG. Please go and check that out. If you want to support this show, please consider joining our Patreon, donating, sharing, talking about it with folks. Share about the show. Retweet the posts. Even on the free tier on our Patreon, you can get incredible updates on the show, some background notes on production, as well as if you back it on a higher tier, you can get early episodes of Dicey Banter released early. In terms of other stuff that I'm in, if you like actual plays, if you like drama and doomed ones, you should go and check out Transplanar RPG, where I play Sayer, the misbeloved twin brother of the Chosen One, who is Doom incarnate. Please enjoy it. We're about to start Arc 3, and it'll be a grand old time. And if you love monsters and monstrosity, you should check out the quick start to my game, The Beast Within. It is an 80s nice grunge action RPG where you play as werebeasts who unleash their wrath. What will you choose? Your humanity or the power of the beast within? Please go and check that out. Use !beast to find the links to that game. And with that, thank you again, Joie, for being a part of this. We're going to rate somebody amazing, no doubt. Please use the rate message in chat. And with that, we'll catch you next time. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.